Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 32. Antiochus I, the Troubled. For only the second time in our story so far, we've come to the end of a sole ruler's lifespan and reign. Antiochus I is dead, long live Antiochus II. However, as with his father, it's useful to look back on what we've covered these past 19 years before we plunge into the next reign with open arms. With that, let's summarise the life and times of Antiochus I. Antiochus I was possibly born around the end of 324 or the beginning of 323 BCE, given that both years have been listed in my sources. His father, the general Seleucus, and his mother, the Sogdian noblewoman Apama, had been married at the mass weddings at Susa in the February of 324 BCE. I'm going to be skipping lightly over the wedding ceremony here, but suffice to say that Seleucus was the only one of around 80 men who didn't reject his Persian wife as soon as he was able to. Bear in mind my approximations are just that, approximations given the possible years, and the reality is that we don't seem to have nailed the exact point down. For example, Bevan, writing in 1902, was of the opinion that Antiochus I was 25 when he fought in the Battle of Ipsus in 301. This would give him an entirely different birth date again of about 326 BCE. The next time Antiochus I shows up is during this selfsame Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. During this battle, he would be chased off the field by Demetrius I. However, his father Seleucus would exploit this situation and use his war elephants to separate Antigonus I and Demetrius I. At the end of the battle, Antigonus lay dead and the Antigonids were defeated. After this clear anti-Antigonid victory at Ipsus, Antiochus's father Seleucus took over Syria and basically replaced Antigonus as the main threat to the Western Hellenistic powers. This tension accordingly resulted in a set of alliances being formed, one of which was between the Seleukids and the fallen Antigonids. This alliance was sealed with the marriage of Seleucus I and Stratonike, the daughter of Demetrius. The reason this is relevant to Antiochus I is that he would fall in love with his stepmother, who was his own age rather than his father's, and would become so ill as a result that his father became afraid that he would die. The court physician Erasistratus eventually revealed the reason for the malady, and Seleucus allowed Antiochus and Stratonike to get married. We discussed this in more detail in episodes 21 and 30, but the takeaway for this narrative is that this happened in about 294 BCE, when Antiochus would have been about 30. At about this same time, Seleucus installed his son as co-king in all the territories east of the Euphrates River. However, for the purposes of a quick summary, the next big step in Antiochus's life would come 13 years later. In September 281 BCE, his father Seleucus was assassinated by Egypt's former heir Ptolemy Ceraunus, while Seleucus was trying to consolidate his hold on Macedon and Thrace. This meant that Antiochus I was no longer a co-king, but instead the sole king of the vast Seleukid Empire. This actually left him in a difficult position, given that Seleucus and Antiochus were separated by hundreds of miles at the time Seleucus died. This left the Seleukid position in the west open to be exploited. As a case in point, Ptolemy Ceraunus had the now leaderless army stationed in Lysimachia acclaim him as the king of Macedon. Antiochus I travelled westward once he got the news, intent on keeping what his father had won from Lysimachus. However, after a brief war with Ceraunus, Antiochus essentially recognised this elder Ptolemy's rule over Macedon, making the straits between Europe and Asia essentially the demarcation point between the two powers. The arrival of the Gauls into the Hellenistic world in the early 270s BCE would uproot everything again. Ptolemy Ceraunus sallied out against them, but his disregard for precautions or reinforcements meant that he was defeated in battle against the leader of the Gauls, Brennus, and was killed. His death prompted a revolving door of kings which would eventually see Antigonus II, the son of Demetrius I, take back his birthright in Macedon, which had been snatched from him following his father's capture by Seleucus years earlier. An attempt was made by a mixed Hellenistic force to prevent the Gauls passing through the passes of Thermopylae, but the Gauls would get round it using the exact same mountain pass the Persians had used centuries before. However, a crucial battle outside Delphi would see the Gauls defeated and driven out of Greece itself, although a band of Gauls under the leadership of two men called Leonorius and Lutarius would raid into Thrace. Not that this was the end of Antiochus's problems, however. Several northern Anatolian kingdoms had created an anti-Seleukid league against him, including Bithynia and its king Nicomedes I. Now, Antiochus I had previously approached the Gauls to try and recruit them as mercenaries against this league, but this hadn't been successful. By contrast, Nicomedes I struck a more convincing tone, and the Gauls under Leonorius were ferried across by Nicomedes. Those following Lutarius would cross in the very same boat that the leader of the Seleukid delegation had used to cross the Bosphorus. The agreement between the Gauls and Nicomedes meant that they were now fighting under the anti-Seleukid League. This soon devolved into the Gauls carving a path of destruction across Anatolia, regardless of who they were supposed to be allied with. Antiochus I would eventually defeat the Gauls in a seminal battle in 275 BCE, where he would follow in his father's footsteps and use Indian elephants to great effect. In the wake of this defeat, the Gauls were eventually settled in the region later known as Galatia, encouraged by Mithridates of Pontus, keen on the prospect of a buffer between him and the Seleucids. The battle also gave Antiochus his epithet of Soter, or Saviour. After this point, war would break out with Ptolemy II, the new ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt. The reason for this was Ptolemy's half-brother Magas declaring himself king of Cyrenaica, which he'd previously ruled over as a governor. Magas was married to Antiochus I's daughter Apama. As such, Antiochus invaded Levantine Ptolemaic possessions once the war began. Magas, incidentally, proved to be no help in the conflict, given that he almost immediately had to deal with the revolt by the Numidians in his territory. The conflict initially went poorly for Ptolemy II, unable as he was to capitalise on his half-brother's problems due to a rebellion in his ranks from a contingent of Gauls he'd got hold of during the Gallic invasions. In their first surge, the Seleucids took Ptolemaic possessions in southern Anatolia and along the coast of Syria. However, the tide began to turn for Ptolemy II once he was married to his sister Arsinoe II, who managed to stabilise the volatile Egyptian court. This allowed him to focus all of his attention on the war. Egypt subsequently pushed back the Seleucids and established bridgeheads in the south of Anatolia. A treaty was eventually signed between Antiochus I and Ptolemy II in 271. After this point, Anatolia can essentially be thought of as divided into three: the Ptolemies in the south, the Seleucids in the middle, and independent kingdoms to the north. Antiochus I now shifted his focus from outright military expansion to the creation and acquisition of cities and fortresses, in an attempt both to protect the vital royal road from raiders and encroach on Ptolemaic possessions without provoking another war. The peace between the two powers, as well as Ptolemy II's preoccupation with the Cremonidean War over in Europe, meant that Anatolia was at peace. However, this fragile situation would change with the death of Philoterus, the ruler of Pergamon, in 263 BCE. Pergamon was at this point still nominally under Seleukid hegemony, but Philoterus had been gradually decoupling it from the Seleucids, as well as using the same city-based techniques to expand his kingdom. His nephew Eumenes I effectively declared independence by taking up the kingship without notifying or seeking permission from his nominal superior Antiochus I. In response, Antiochus prepared to invade and remove Eumenes I from his position. However, Eumenes was prepared for this and preemptively invaded Seleukid territory, catching Antiochus off guard and not yet fully prepared. Antiochus was defeated outside of Sardis in 261 and signed a peace treaty soon after. This effectively meant that Pergamon broke away, although Eumenes wouldn't declare himself officially king, preventing further reprisals. Soon after, on the 2nd of June 261 BCE, Antiochus I died fighting the Gauls near Ephesus. His eldest son had already died around 266 BCE, executed by his father for rebellion. Seleucus seems to have been frustrated that he hadn't been given any real power yet despite his lofty position. However, it's worth noting there may have been another source of tension within the royal family. This is because Antiochus may, like his father, have remarried at some point to a woman called Nyssa, inflaming tensions with the young co-king. Regardless, his death meant that the throne passed to his younger brother Antiochus II upon their father's death. And so, with the recap of his reign done, now we come to the epithet which I've decided to award him, namely, the Troubled. As with the one I gave to his father, this has two meanings. The first relates to the murder of his own son, something which neither Seleucus I nor Ptolemy I had done, and which may have plagued him and sapped his strength during the rest of his reign. Even before Seleucus the young king's death, there was a web of suspicion and mistrust in the Seleukid family. To my mind, that mess of violence, deception and anger seems to warrant an epithet like the Troubled. However, there is a second interpretation, and that is one of geopolitics. Antiochus I, by very nature of his being hundreds of miles from his father when the latter was assassinated, faced a difficult situation. Had he been in Ionia when Seleucus I was killed, perhaps it would have been easier to step into the power vacuum left behind and assume control. The mere fact that some areas continued to mint Seleukid coins years after the event shows that there were bulwarks of Seleukid support. To my mind, the death of Seleucus I meant a loss of momentum which other powers could exploit, and which would be difficult to reverse. In this analogy, it's easier to keep the ball rolling than it is to start it back up again once it's stopped. So, in this interpretation, the epithet refers to the monumental task Antiochus I had ahead of him throughout his reign. Throughout the reign of Antiochus I, we've seen pretty much constant warfare or revolt, with states either trying to nibble away at the edges or outright declaring themselves to be independent. In part thanks to the calming role of Arsinoe II in the court of Egypt, and in part thanks to the loss of manpower in the Gallic invasions, the Seleucids proved unable to fully rise against this challenge. And yet, the Seleucids adapted. Antiochus shifted his strategy, allowing him to consolidate and even encroach without provoking the Egyptians into another war. This was apparently very much in keeping with his father's strategy. Seleucus apparently similarly only fought if he knew he would win. So, what to make of Antiochus I? Well, it's hard to say. Bevan himself, in 1902, vented his frustrations on the fact that comparatively little evidence remains of his reign. Quote, "It is hardly possible from our scanty materials to arrive at any idea of the personality of the first Antiochus, to penetrate to the real man whose work we have been attempting to follow." End quote. However, despite the obvious family problems, he does appear to have made a monumental effort to hold everything together. He may not have as glamorous a track record as his father, but perhaps he faced far more difficult circumstances. As such, this mixed legacy seems to me to warrant this new 21st century epithet. So, that's the reign of Antiochus I. Next time in our narrative, we're going to cover what we know of Antiochus II up until the time of his father's death in 261. However, that will be the episode after next. Next time then, we're going to head east and catch up with India's history up until 232 BCE, as well as the edicts of Ashoka, which likely is not feature our new sovereign, Antiochus II. Until then, thank you all for listening. For any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch at the show's email address. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.